Welcome, everyone, to the 7th episode of InteropTalk. I'm your moderator, Dave Cassel, Chief Customer Officer at Health Gorilla and former Executive Director at Care Equality. With me is Dr. Stephen Lane, Chief Medical Officer here at Health Gorilla and former Director of Clinical Informatics and Interoperability at Sutter Health. Joining us as usual is Jennifer Blumenthal, Director of Product for OneRecord at Milliman and IntelliScript, and Deven McGraw, Data Sharing Lead at Invitae and former Deputy Director for Health Information Privacy at HHS. So speaking of HHS, let's start today with some breaking news out of OIG, which just released the information blocking enforcement final rule. And Deven, can I impose on you to start just to give some brief background specifically on the type of rule this is and what folks can expect as they start to dig into it?
Oh, I'd be happy to. So under the 21st Century Cures Act, the information blocking rules, which were developed by the HHS Office of the National Coordinator, are enforced by the HHS Office of the Inspector General. And the Cures Act specified what the penalties would be for violations of the information blocking rule against just two types of actors. So it's $1 million per violation if you violate the information blocking rule and you are a certified health information technology vendor, or you are a health information exchange, health information network, if you qualify under that definition. Healthcare providers, which are also covered by the information blocking rules, are subject to a different set of penalties. And so consequently, we know that we don't have any penalties yet to be established there. But OIG nevertheless has established this enforcement rule, which is really a set of procedural steps that it will take in enforcing the rule against all actors. In my view, it's most relevant in situations where the penalties are already established. And that, again, is penalties that apply to certified EHR vendors and HIEs and HINs, as opposed to, when there's no penalties available on the provider end, it's hard to see what OIG is going to do from an enforcement perspective. But again, this is largely a procedural rule. All the substance around what constitutes information blocking and exceptions and whether you qualify for one or not, those were all established by ONC, and ONC continues to put out guidance on the substance. But anytime you can face the long arm of the law and be potentially penalized, there has to be due process protections in place and a sort of set of rules around how those proceedings are going to take place. And that's essentially what this rule is. It was initially proposed by OIG way back on April 20th of 2020. So really kind of right at the beginning of the pandemic, and just finalized today. I think that one of the most important pieces of it, I know lots of folks, including myself, are still kind of reading through it. I really want to see how this compares to what was proposed. Were any changes made? It doesn't actually look like they made any changes to what they had proposed. Again, it was all procedural, but they did clarify that the rule will go into effect 60 days from having been published in the Federal Register. So what came out today was just a draft. Clock doesn't start till it's in the Federal Register, which could happen as early as next week. We'll be keeping an eye out for that. And they've also said that they are not going to hold anyone retroactively. They're not going to penalize people for behavior that occurred prior to the rule having gone into effect. But they also reinforced what their enforcement priorities will be. And one of the criteria that they're looking at is like an extended pattern of information blocking behavior, in addition to looking out for things that could cause harm to patients. And so that suggests to me that if you filed a complaint against someone previously for some behavior, you might want to refile it if it's continuing.
And actually, I was going to ask you that because I thought I saw that in some materials, and I have not had a chance to look at them exhaustively. This came out this morning, but I did think that I had seen that, and I was a little puzzled by it because it seemed like exactly what you just said, that is everything just sort of being the slate wiped clean for everything that has already been complained about.
Yeah, and I'll say, this is what they told us at High Tech years ago, was that their intention was to open the portal to receive complaints, but that they said early on that they were not going to investigate any complaints that were submitted prior to the finalization of the rules. So I think you're right that there is, I just looked at the website, and there are now 700 complaints that have been registered through the website, since it went live. And I think that, I'm curious to find out whether HHS is planning on reaching out to the complainants that submitted their contact information to say, hey, thanks very much, but if this is still bugging you, you should probably resubmit it. I think that there's probably a place for a industry-wide discussion of this, once it's clear how this is going to go, because clearly those 700 information blocking complaints, bothered people enough to go through the process to report them.
Well, exactly. But if you want to establish that that behavior is still happening, as opposed to something that might have been corrected and for which OIG is unlikely to act on it, again, because they've said that we want this to be prospective in its application, you kind of need to refile. And I would wait to refile until 60 days from the day of the Federal Register filing, and ideally have, not just, I'm refiling my complaint, I have no idea if they're still doing this or not, but some indication that the behavior has not been corrected. But I don't know that they wipe the slate clean. Like I actually think that establishing a pattern, even though you wouldn't get penalized for past behavior, if you want to establish that pattern that kicks it up in the priority, because they'll have a lot of complaints and they won't be able to investigate them all, that you would want to still have documentation that initial complaint was filed.
Yeah,
that's a good point and an interesting nuance. Yeah, sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, you made a really good point, Deven, which is that this was a procedural rule primarily, that it will apply both to complaints. Well, it'll apply to complaints against all three actor types, though it's clearer to see where we're going to go in the two actor types where there is the monetary penalty. Obviously, and again, when you look at the numbers, the vast majority of complaints of information blocking have been against providers, and they've been by patients or patient representatives. So even though we have not yet established what the disincentives for providers are going to be, the procedural aspects of today's rule will still apply once we know what those disincentives are. Is that fair?
Yep, absolutely.
And just for everyone who's listening, we're anticipating a notice of proposed rulemaking for provider disincentives around the September timeframe. We'll see whether that slides one way or the other, meaning that we may have a public comment period before the end of the year, and potentially, and Deven and I have disagreed about this before, potentially see a final rule in the early part of next year.
So Jennifer, you've been uncharacteristically quiet, and I'm guessing from our brief email exchanges earlier in the day that you might have some thoughts.
I mean, this is the best podcast ever. I mean, first of all, how do you guys feel? You are a health information network. You are actors named under the rule. I'm going to turn that back to you, and then we can come back to me. How do you feel about that?
Actually, I mean, our business literally is helping open up interoperability, and we do have mechanisms for helping patients if patients come to us themselves wanting to get their information. So I'm actually not concerned from our standpoint. I think that we're also probably relatively low on the list for those who are going to complain about information blocking because of the nature of our business. But, I could be proven wrong.
So what I'm most excited about is the if you think about EHRs, right? Certified technology vendors, their go live date for their R4 APIs was 12/31/22, but let's just call it and say January, the first week of January, right? Most of those EHRs that have certified or listed on Chapel are currently not publishing their FHIR URLs. So they're publishing like their sandbox or their production base URLs, but they're not publishing the FHIR URLs for all their clients. And you need those FHIR URLs to figure out a lot about how the APIs are going to work. So for me, this is really exciting because I consider this information blocking. Like if you do not publish the list of FHIR URLs, you do not know who the clients are. So the exception to this are like the top 10 vendors. There's over 200 products on Chapel that are listed and certified for the G10 update, which is where you get the, the patient access APIs, the provider access APIs, and the bulk FHIR and things of that sort. So this to me is just ammo. It's just a tool in my toolkit as I'm talking to these EHR vendors about their FHIR APIs, because now there's something to enforce against that. It's no longer just kind of passing the baton or saying, oh, well, we're not certified yet, or we hit a glitch and we can't do this yet. Like they've had so long. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing that I'm really excited about is, well, actually, I think the problem for what Deven just said was the penalties against providers and what Stephen just said about the notice of proposed rules. So what I find with a lot of these smaller specialty EHRs is they're really putting the onus on their clients, their provider organizations, to enable requesters or third-party developers for their APIs. And I don't think that providers are equipped to do that. And it's going to be kind of a he said, she said situation on how to bring a third-party developer live. I think that's going to be interesting from someone who's actually submitted information blocking complaints from the beginning. I'm almost tempted to go back into the portal and see what I wrote and look at to see if the people that I complained against are they still info blockers, right? That's what I'm kind of curious about. Yeah.
If you submit the same complaint, two times years apart, then you've certainly established a pattern.
I think the question is, the pattern is going to be the same. It is the intent versus implementation of the law. The question is it the same person not really following that implementation? But I think that the problems that I encountered over the past 3 years are going to be persistent, especially when you get beyond the top 10 vendors. They've already had their DST2 APIs out. They've had time to work on how to onboard third-party applications. It's the rest of the market in closing that interoperability gap who are really going to struggle with how do they onboard third-party applications? How do they get their customers to upgrade to G10? I've already had a couple of emails from EHR vendors being like, oh, we're so excited to work with you and our sales team, because they still need to go sell the upgrade. So there's going to be a long tail adoption to providers represented by all those EHRs who also are not represented on national networks or in TEFCA, it's going to be a little tough. I'm excited though. I've been calling Deven all week asking her questions.
Jen, you asked the question about, if you're an HIE/HIN, what, does this make you nervous? Again, when you go look at the complaints that have been registered, of the over 700 complaints on the website, only 3 of them have been against HIE/HIN. So it's clearly not been the major focus there. Someone asked me a question today, which I wanted to bring to this group and to you in particular, Deven. The definition of what it means to be an HIE/HIN under the information blocking rules is pretty inclusive, right? Mm-hmm. It has to do with facilitating exchange between unrelated, entities. Yep. I know in my clinical organization, when these rules first came out, we determined that we were also an HIE/HIN in addition to being a provider. And I think that that's pretty common because we allow unaffiliated providers to use our EHR, and in so doing, provide network type connectivity. And I think a lot of providers have made that same determination. What I wonder is whether that would also apply to payers, who are often involved in exchanging data or facilitating the exchange of data between, other multiple providers that use their system, in the process of them doing their business. And I'm just curious, have any of you heard anyone interpreting the HIE/HIN definition as potentially including especially larger payers involved in ACOs and other kinds of value-based care arrangements?
I think I read today when I was cruising through the document that it feels like if you are a provider actor, but acting as a cert technology or an HIE or HIN, then you fall into that category, and then, these penalties could apply. I definitely think it's going to apply for payviders, right? So you think about the CMS patient access APIs, a bulk of them were payviders. So they're, providers and payers, but there's a lot of health systems now offering MA plans, right? So then they're going to get booked into that. My assumption was always for payers, they will be on the hook at a certain point for information blocking, but we have to do the named actors under the law first, because their first, trip down interoperability land was with the CMS 9115-F, those FHIR APIs. So my assumption is a couple of years from now, they'll roll out some sort of info blocking for payers. I guess it's just, do you qualify as another kind of entity right now, or another kind of actor?
Yeah, I've definitely heard people ask questions about whether health plans, depending, and it really, of course, it depends on what kind of functionality. The mere fact that you collect data from lots of other disparate sources in order to claims process is not going to trigger. You basically have had to set up a network that enables the facilitation of data between two entities where your involvement in that transaction is just creating the pipes and allowing that to happen, I think. And I also think that the plans are going to try very hard to say that they don't meet that definition. And in the meantime, there's a crap ton of low-hanging fruit of entities that clearly do meet the definition, and for whom, while there may not be that many complaints that have been filed to date, there may be an uptick in them now that enforcement, or once enforcement becomes available, because there's now the potential for it to mean something if you file a complaint against one of these entities. I think you got a lot of complaints filed against providers, and many of them were in the patient access context, because there were a lot of sophisticated patients who understood what they were supposed to be getting, and they didn't get it, and they filed complaints about it. And I don't know this from an exhaustive review of the types of complaints that can be filed, but I don't think that the absence of a lot of complaints against the two other types of actors means that you won't see them now that stuff's getting real, and there's actually investigations that will happen from at some point 60 days from next week or the week after, whenever the Federal Register notice posts.
Do you think that there's a difference between like high tech and MU enforcement and penalties versus information blocking enforcement and penalties? I was talking to a provider organization, and they were like, yeah, they didn't really ever enforce those MU penalties. They never doled them out. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't know that anybody ever got dinged. People might not have gotten as much of their incentive payment as they might have wanted, but I don't know that anybody ever had to pay the penalty that existed for the initial part of the incentive payments. But this is $1 million per violation.
What
set
is
in stone if you are found to be information blocking? That's the thing I definitely want to see if they've clarified, is what constitutes a violation, because in HIPAA enforcement land, if you deny a patient the right to their health information, you could have a penalty assessed for every day that you didn't provide information that you were obligated to provide. So that was a daily violation. You violated the rule on day 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. And if it was multiple patients, it could really ratchet up. Same thing with, failure to have a risk assessment. Every day you didn't have one in place, you were violating the rule. So it didn't count once, it counted several times. Breach of data counted by person. And so I just don't know how it's one thing I'm going to explore is how you count a violation. Is a violation $1 million because you didn't, post your production fire endpoints for how many days after you were required to? Does that accrue every day? Is it up to $1 million? Like, how's that going to go down? Or is it just $1 million because you failed on this particular point and we're not going to count it on a daily basis? I don't
Devin,
know.
once you do your analysis, I hope you give us a nice long LinkedIn post that we can reference.
I want to know if an interference is an API call.
An API, say what you mean
Yeah,
by that.
what do you mean by that?
Well, if you think about the workflow, like how many different, there's a couple of API calls when you're requesting via those fire APIs. So like, are you going to count every single API call as an interference? And can you just count that up and you can really rack up the monies there? I would think so. I think OIG should consider that.
I guess it depends
Not
on
one
what-
API call. There's multiple API calls going back and forth, depending on which workflow you're utilizing.
Maybe it depends on just how egregious they think you are and how much they just really want to crater your company. I guess we'll see.
I have seen we saw this on the payer side with the payer patient access APIs. We saw some very interesting interpretations of the Smart on Fire spec with a lot of customization around that. We are also seeing that with the EHR vendors, not just with the patient access, but with bulk fire. And there's a couple of calls that are happening. Those could be each an interference, a single interference. I want to know the answer to this.
It actually is a fair question. It will be interesting as we dig into the details to see if in fact they have addressed that and if so, how.
You have to assume that OIG is going to do a webinar at some point and open it up for questions, but who knows?
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift gears away from $1 million penalties and information blocking, and talk a little bit about TEFCA and fire. And first up on that front, OneUp's Don Rucker, former national coordinator at ONC, has been making the rounds, and he's been talking about TEFCA and on the one hand, he's entitled to his views, right? And on the other, because he is a former national coordinator, those views are garnering attention. So putting it out there, what do folks think of his complaints? And Stephen, if you wanted to briefly sort of summarize what some of his positions are, that might be helpful.
I mean, I've talked to Don about this personally on a couple of occasions, and he's written a few different blog posts and letters to HHS. And I think the core complaint that he has is that we should be doing all this on fire. That he interprets the version 1 of TEFCA relying on document-based exchange as being as including only non-computable data, which I think we could certainly argue about, and really not being worth the time to implement TEFCA on anything other than fire. And I think all of us agree that fire is the future, that fire provides all sorts of additional functionality, supports additional use cases, I think has tremendous benefits over and above or as a supplement to document-based exchange. But as we've had clarified from ONC, TEFCA will support exchange of V2, it'll support exchange of documents, it'll support exchange of fire, it will support all of that. It's a trust framework. There are technical components for sure, and version 1 that we've seen of the QN technical framework does not reference fire directly, but I think the RCE and ONC have been very clear publicly that they're planning to bring out a version 2 of the QN technical framework and the common agreement that will support fire exchange, and I think they've said it's going to likely happen next year. There's been a fire roadmap published for quite some time that shows that will be coming. So I think Don's concerns are valid, that we want to move towards fire as quickly as possible. I don't really share the opinion that there's no value in getting TEFCA up and running before we're ready to exchange fire.
It feels to me like it's just the latest version of the age-old debate about whether infrastructure is needed for exchange of health information. And it kind of reminds me of, this sort of very early on national coordinators, Farzad Mastashari, and pushing direct after there had been in the a bunch of funds that went out for health information exchanges, right? If you think about the high-tech funding, the bulk of it went to, purchase, to enable the purchase of certified electronic health records where it was intended to ultimately facilitate exchange of health information. Some of the money also went to support infrastructure and there was a huge amount of debate at the time about whether we had flipped the investment in the wrong way. Should we have instead been focusing on more investments in infrastructure to enable exchange versus, technology that, that ultimately would not necessarily get exchange done necessarily on its own. So there's always historically been among national coordinators differences of opinion on what's the best way to facilitate exchange. And this to me is just, iteration number 3, 4, 5. And we know that when Dr. Rucker was the head of ONC, he didn't do very much to facilitate TEFCA as a voluntary network, notwithstanding language in high tech and the Cures Act with respect to establishing that network. And this is something that Dr. Tripathi feels more strongly about. So, he's entitled to feel the way he feels. And if it gets us more quickly to fire exchange through networks, I think, all the better. But we have this networked environment that has existed for a long time that wasn't connected to FHIR, that was using different specs. Why would we not try to leverage what's there now, even as we migrate to FHIR? Because frankly, those HIEs and HINs that are connected in through national networks today, that are going to be the backbone of the TEFCA infrastructure in the future, have been exchanging data this whole time successfully for their customers, just for a very narrow, mostly treatment only use case. So at any rate, I'm not surprised. He definitely has a viewpoint. He's entitled to it, but it just feels like, again, round 3 of a long war that we have had about what's the best way to do this. And working on TEFCA while we improve FHIR adoption seems to me to make a lot of sense, because why would we not continue to leverage infrastructure that we've already frankly built and spent money on?
I think sometimes when people say FHIR, and this is, Dave, please correct me as I say this. When people talk about FHIR, I don't think they always differentiate between the actual API and then the FHIR resources. And I think that's important, because a lot of times what I'm seeing are people want FHIR APIs because they're easier to implement. It's a low, you don't have to have it as such, you don't have to have a big background in traditional IHE plumbing and implementing that, right? So FHIR APIs are easier to work with. Developers want to use them. And then what you get from a FHIR API, it could be FHIR resources, it could be CCDAs, it could actually be a FHIR wrapper, and then there's XCA and XCPD in the background. So I think that there is, I think this concept of the current TEFCA roadmap versus the FHIR roadmap is going to, I mean, this is just where we're going. I agree with everything Deven just said about there was an opportunity to implement a FHIR roadmap if the person wanted to implement a FHIR roadmap originally. But I think it's an interesting place to be creative with what does FHIR look like at scale. And I'm excited to see what it looks like. I'm not optimistic that it's going to be fast. I think it's going to be a couple of years. You guys might know better than I do, but that's what I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I know that certainly the current leadership at ONC wants it to be faster than a couple of years. we'll certainly see if they're successful, as we've seen in attempts to launch fire-based exchange for Kira quality. There are some thorny considerations that continue to confound Kira quality's efforts there. I do think that we'll be able to see some experimental things, at least via TEFCA. But in terms of the wide range of fire deployment between QHINs, and I'll come back to why I make that distinction here in a second, that may, that there is still some work to be done there. It may take some time into next year, as Stephen was saying, even under their roadmap. But I said between QHINs, because that to me is what frustrates me the most about this whole fire and TEFCA brouhaha. People look at the QTF, which defines the technical specifications for how you exchange between the actual qualified health information networks. You can think of it as being how the low-level nodes behind the scenes on the internet are communicating with one another, or in the financial industry, what they're using, and to say like, oh my goodness, they're using technology from the 1990s. Well, yeah, of course they are, because they're so fundamental, and it would be so disruptive to change it that why fix what isn't broken. Participants interacting with their QHINs on the other side of it absolutely will be using fire. Our customers certainly will. I can only assume that we are not the only ones who will be interacting with our customers via APIs. And so we're translating that for them into this low-level protocol, the IHE profiles that are used for document exchange between the QHINs. And then we're taking those documents, we're consuming them, and we can serve them up as documents, or we can serve them up as fire resources. And again, I don't want to make it about our functionality. I assume it's not unique, but this is exactly what the TEFCA infrastructure allows, in terms of lots of creative things that you can do between the QHIN and within the QHIN's community, that is then enabled on a grand scale by the standard protocols, which again were put in place precisely because they were already adopted by those health information networks that were going to become QHINs. So it's not that like there is no fire in the TEFCA universe. The fire is just done more at the QHIN level than at the QHIN to QHIN level, if that makes sense. So with that, keeping generally on the TEFCA topic, we recently saw an announcement out of Epic that's Kaiser Permanente, Johns Hopkins, and 25 others, not to lump these others who I'm sure are prestigious organizations in their own right into the also rans, but a large number of organizations that use Epic came out and indicated that they were going to participate in the TEFCA, pledged to join essentially. And clearly this is a signal from Epic about their community. They're beyond these organizations that were part of this initial announcement. They're stating that they expect the majority of their community, extremely large majority, 2,000 hospitals, et cetera, in their announcement, to participate in a relatively short time frame. So what do we make of that signal from Epic in terms of what it might mean for TEFCA overall, what it reveals about them? Any thoughts that we have?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's huge as a longtime Epic user myself, and participant in the Epic community focusing on advancing interoperability therein. I think having Epic on board, having Epic supporting QHIN participate or TEFCA participation is really going to drive the entire industry. I think that Epic was instrumental in helping to get Kira quality up and running, and once Commonwealth and the rest of the folks joined in, that really created the framework that we have today. And I think it's the same thing if you've got big players, as we do with Epic and Commonwealth and eHealth and Health Gorilla and others. others, who are already participating in the existing exchange, having them publicly state an intention to bring their network participants over into TEFCA exchange, I think really is going to help TEFCA to gain the traction that we all hope it's going to gain.
But I'll tell you what, the finalization of this enforcement rule and the fact that enforcement could begins to, you have a table that is now set for, oh, you're a part of the TEFCA network. You are permitted to respond to this. You've decided that local policy, you've set the bar higher. What's the justification for that? Right. And is it a reasonable justification for you to say no when the query otherwise meets what's been asked for from the common agreement and the underlying PMPs, policies and procedures?
And do we need to wait for TEFCA for those kinds of complaints to be registered, or could they
No,
be now under care equality?
They could be registered now under care equality. I mean, once the rule goes into effect. It's
64
like
days.
you had a query that came to you that met all the policy requirements that was lawful for you to respond to, and you chose not to. Why?
Stephen, are we allowed to talk about our meeting today?
Which one?
The quality steering.
Oh, I don't think so. No.
Okay, never mind. Scratch that from the tape.
Well, Jennifer, were you? I might have missed the secret hand signal between you and Stephen, but were you talking about the Care Quality Steering Committee meeting or about something different?
Yeah, it was.
I mean, I think that what we're all mysteriously referring to is that today the Care Quality Steering Committee, and I don't think this is particularly secret, but I guess we'll confirm before we put this out. But the Care Quality Steering Committee approved an update to its policies. This still does need to go through one additional hurdle with the Care Quality Implementer community, but that I think is probably largely going to be a foregone conclusion. So the policy updates that the Care Quality adopted did include some additional context around the patient request permitted purpose as it's framed in the Care Quality parlance.
And the big change, I think, which is worth including, is shifting from saying that care quality connections may respond to patient requests, changing that to should respond to patient requests.
Inching ever closer.
But not a must, it's a should.
Not a must, no, yeah.
And the way, I was pretty quiet on this approval process because honestly, I didn't feel like being the only one with a dog in the fight here. But I think that to what Deven just said, that will be interesting if that policy goes into place and people start making patient access requests and then still getting, denied or no, or whatever the answer is back in the message. How does that play in, right? How does health information networks, Stephen once corrected me. He goes, Care Quality is not a health information network. It is a framework, Jenny. And I was like, okay, noted. But, right. Still, if it's still a question. Well, I guess.
That's Care Quality's, that's a statement that Care Quality makes about how it wants itself to be labeled. That is a different question from whether it meets the definition of a health information network under information blocking.
But either way, I think that I am optimistic about patient access in general, but I think it needs people to, stomp their feet and bang on the wall and make a lot of noise for it to move forward. When I think about the OneRecord app and just like the hurdles that we overcame, and we still have a lot of active users, people coming in every day. The other day, our MFA workflow wasn't working, and we had all these people angry, banging at the door, being like, it's not taking my PIN. So we have high intent users getting their data, right? I think that the more channels you open up to consumers to get their data, whether it's through a state HIE, like with what Deven's doing, or through a national network like Carequality, or through a QHIN like Epic's QHIN. Will Epic respond? We don't know yet. But I think over time, I assume that there will be a point that they do respond, because it will look really bad if they don't, and everybody else, every other QHIN does. Like, that's just the bottom line. That's bad PR. I think the Epic is smarter than that, right?
But again, it's not, it won't be Epic doing the blocking. It would be the provider doing the blocking.
Well, then we should have HHS finish up those penalties, right? That's the agency that needs to define them, Deven.
Yes. Yeah, it's but it doesn't mean that enforcement actions can't start. There's just no question. There's a question about what then happens if OIG does an investigation of a provider, believes they have an information blocking charge to sustain, but there isn't sort of an end point to that. It will take some time. That's the other thing about procedure, there's a due process piece to this, right? And OIG has a nice little diagram actually on their website about how this, there's an investigation. OIG will decide if they think that there's information blocking or not. There's a lot of back and forth with submission of documents and interviews and, did you or didn't you? They have to figure out how they're applying the knowledge standard. And then even if they get to the point where OIG says, well, we think you blocked, if there is a penalty on the table, they can issue the penalty, but then there are appeal rights associated with that. And I would imagine that some of these early cases may be appealed, depending on the circumstances. And then if there isn't sort of a penalty on the table yet, do they go into some sort of suspension pen, right? Well, you not suspension from like practicing medicine or something, but like, we think you're information blocking. We don't have any penalties for you yet. So we're going to hold you here and we're going to hold on to this investigation. And then once we figure out what your penalties are, we're going to refer you for those because the rules in effect. Yeah.
Taking a break from TEFCA, and I know we've been talking for a long time, going back to the FHIR APIs and penalties that just dropped today, something that I found interesting with, the 190 EHR vendors on the market is that a lot of them, one, aren't publishing their FHIR URLs, but two, when I talk to the vendors, a lot of their clients have abandoned their patient portals, so they're no longer paying for them and supporting them. So there is no way to do the three-legged OAuth workflow. There's literally no way for patients to get their data and authenticate. And I'm wondering when people start paying attention to that and the question of if providers and the rest of the EHR vendors on the market join TEFCA, like it's going to have to be an IL2 workflow, or they're going to have to enable some sort of additional portal to give a set of credentials to hit an authorization server. And, I think the reason why providers aren't supporting those patient portals anymore is one, cost, and then probably two, the adoption rate. And there's no, I don't think that MIPS or MACRA applies anymore. Like they don't get pinged for not having people hitting those patient portals. So you still have an identity problem in people accessing their data through the FHIR workflow. And it's a question of how does that come into TEFCA at a certain point. I don't think that's in the next 2 years, but they're going to be collecting this information and they're going to have to make decisions going forward. And I do think it is a more simplistic workflow to query to a network to get your data instead of authenticating against multiple portals.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I think that we're most likely to see success with some sort of login with Google kind of concept where we all decide to trust the authentication that's done by somebody or some small set of certified entities, whatever the case may be, and then send tokens around. But obviously there's more work to be done on that. But once you do that, I'm not quite sure what. Even if you take everyone at their word in terms of what they object to in the IAL2 stuff today, I'm not sure what would remain to reasonably object to at that point, as long as there were some good options to pick from.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just back to a paper workflow. And why did you put all this funding in place to still be paper-based? That rhymed.
Right, rhyming is maybe a good thing to end on, because we are at time. So let's wrap up there. Thank you, as always, Stephen, Devin, and Jennifer, and we will see you next time.